Welcome back to Unlapped. It was a spicy weekend in Austria, which results in a lot of things to talk about and break down. We've got it all here for you on Unlapped. I'm Katie George, and as always, I'm joined by Nate Saunders and Laurence Edmondson. Great to see you both. Laz, you were on the ground in Austria, but you both have been busy as well. Did you not stop by Milton Keynes at Red Bull and do what, a tour of sorts to discuss powertrains?
Yeah, Red Bull very kindly invited us to their factory ahead of Silverstone. Of course, they're not too far away from Silverstone and Milton Keynes. And they showed us around their new power unit factory, which is quite impressive. And of course, is going to be incredibly important from 2026 onwards, because that could be the difference between them continuing this run of competitiveness, domination at times, certainly racing for race victories or not. And so, we got a bit of a sneak peek of what they're doing there. Everything looks quite well advanced. They all seem quite confident, but no one really knows where they stand compared to everyone else at this stage. But yeah, I'd say there's a quiet confidence there. But of course, there was the small match of the weekend, which we weren't there to discuss. So there'll be a lot more discussion of that when we get to Silverstone. But that was also hanging over the place a little bit.
Nate, what were your thoughts of it?
Yeah, it was to that point we had a round table with Christian Horner and the two guys from Ford, and you could tell all of us were kind of like, well, we could ask about last weekend, but let's not, because it was, very much a Ford and Red Bull event. Yeah, I thought it was really cool. There's been a lot of kind of whispers about the Red Bull project actually this year, in the context of like, oh well, Max and Jos aren't convinced Red Bull are going to be very quick in 26, blah blah blah. But I mean, obviously, you can only judge what you see in front of you. It looks incredibly high tech. Pretty interesting backstory as well to it, because Christian Horner actually showed us around. I'm right in saying, Laurence, he said what before they bought that, it was a building that made bubble wrap. I don't know if that's what you call it in America.
Yeah.
But so it's kind of this cool, and it's become this much bigger building. They've actually had to expand it because they have employed so many people. They suddenly realized like, oh, we actually need another wing for this kind of design office. So yeah, really cool. And it's nice to kind of get a peek behind that, because what's always amazing is how many people actually work for these teams. We see the race teams every week. When you actually go into a factory, you see the sheer amount of work that goes in. And this is for a project that's not even on the track yet. This is for 2026. So pretty incredible. They're doing all of that. And obviously they've still got their kind of current race winning and kind of championship probably winning operation going on as well. So yeah, really, really great, and a great facility up there, Milton Keynes. It's probably the only good thing about Milton Keynes, to be honest with you. It's not great, not a great part of the UK, but that is pretty great.
You said that.
I think Katie, everyone in the UK has said it at some point.
Okay,
It's
all
not
right, fair
great.
enough.
It's not great.
You might not have asked Christian Horner questions about the weekend, but I've got a lot of questions that I want to ask you guys about, because it was entertaining to say the least. After a 1-2 qualifying from Max and Lando, they became the main topic of discussion. 8 laps out, 8 laps left in the race. They collided, causing damage to both of their cars. Lando, unfortunately, was forced to retire because of the damage. Max managed to finish in 5th place, and George Russell was able to capitalize, and he got a second F1 victory in F1. And Oscar Piastri, and Carlos Sainz rounded out the podium. I guess the biggest question is who's at fault. And in typical Formula One fashion, drivers play the blame game, and they don't usually say, hey, that one was on me. So Laz, you were on the ground. You watched it unfold in person. Just what was your take on the moment between the two close friends? I think that's important to mention that they are very close friends.
They are. One cool thing about being there in person, actually, before I get fully stuck into it, is that the media center the Red Bull ring is right above the main grandstand, and through this giant window you can see turn 3 right at the top of the hill. And you see the cars going up there. They're kind of quite small from the distance, your little specks going up the hill, but obviously that's happening in real time through the window. And what we're watching on the TV has this delay on it because of the nature of filming and sending it around the world, and funny enough then coming back to the TVs in the media center. And so, you could watch it up there. And each time it was just, even from that far away, just so gripping, so thrilling to see the two cars go side by side into there. But of course, it ended badly. And I think there's few people outside of Red Bull who felt that Max wasn't to blame for the collision. I think it's fairly clear that he angled his car in a way that left Lando with very little space on the outside. and therefore there was a collision. And that's the way the stewards saw it, and that's why he got a 10-second penalty. All fine. I don't think there's too many people that disagree with the way the stewards dealt with that. The question was maybe some of the ones earlier, had there been some intervention slightly earlier by the stewards, because Max was moving his car slightly, pinching Lando towards the inside every time Lando went up there. I think the only time he didn't do it was lap 63, the lap before, because Lando forced him wide. So it was real kind of like on the edge racing. And there's a lot of questions now about whether that's acceptable. And, that's something we can get into. But I think one thing that we should say is that Max being able to do this is quite remarkable. Like you might think that it's a little bit kind of over the edge, and I think often at times it has been, and certainly when they had the collision. But to be able to just kind of like put your car in that space under braking is quite remarkable. But of course, it is an issue then for the car behind, and so I think it was kind of pretty much bang on, because if you get to a point where every time there's a little bit of something or other, the stewards are looking at it and giving penalties out, I think that does create a problem. But when you have a situation where Lando had nowhere to go and it ultimately caused a collision, then that's what the penalty is for. It's for causing a collision, not for moving under braking. And I think that was the difference. So I actually think, shame it ended the way it did, because I think it could have been a great battle going forward. It looked like Lando was going to get a 5-second penalty anyway for his track limits violations. But then Max may have got a penalty for running wide and keeping the position on lap 63. So, it could have actually balanced out, and we could have had a genuine race to the finish. So bit of a shame we missed out on that. But otherwise, I just found it so enthralling to watch.
Well, it's not a luxury that we've gotten recently or consistently over the past few seasons, right? We don't see Max in all-out battles against other drivers that often on track. And so that's why I think it's unbelievably compelling. But when Max has been in those battles, Nate, he is an aggressive driver. I think we can all say that that's one of his strengths, certainly, and why he's so successful. But Lando Norris, after the race, said that his defending, Max Verstappen's defending, was reckless and desperate. Do you feel like that's a fair assessment given where they were in the race at that point?
Yeah, I think, desperate. As we saw after the race, Max was pretty upset with the fact he was even in that position in the first place. Red Bull, very uncharacteristically, and I think across the board, you're starting to see the impact of the pressure McLaren are putting on Red Bull. We're seeing Max get in these situations. We're seeing Red Bull maybe being less than their usual selves a little bit more often. I don't know about, reckless. I think that's just how Max races. I think that Max blurs that line, in terms of playing fair when it comes to wheel racing. And I don't say that to completely disparage him. A lot of drivers have had an edge to them. Senna had an edge. Schumacher, who I grew up, is my favorite driver growing up. He didn't play fair all the time either. And it was kind of this weird kind of paradox when you supported him, like, okay, he just really wants to win, guys. Like, that's kind of his thing. I actually thought the best quote on Max wasn't, I think Lando was just kind of upset and knew that should have been win number 2 for him and not for George Russell. I think the best quote about Max was actually Andreas Stella, the McLaren boss, after that. I think it comes back to, he was very respectful. Stella gives a great interview because he's got such a great way of talking, but he basically said, this should have been clamped down on in 2021. When Max was having that fight with with Lewis. And I think that's the first thing I thought when I saw it, was this reminds me again of those two guys fighting in 2021. And it's an interesting one because I think ultimately Max, there's a long laundry list of drivers, isn't there, that have had issues with him. It's not just Lewis in 2021. That same corner in 2019, he pushed Charles Leclerc wide. They had to change the rules about moving under braking for Max. I think it was 16 or 17 they had to do that. Sebastian Vettel and Kimi and Lewis back then were all saying like this at the time, like this kid is, that's when he was a lot more reckless. I think he's honed that down a bit more. But on the flip side to that, we haven't seen him actually been in this situation that often recently. So maybe this is something that just hasn't ever gone away. Max hasn't really needed to kind of put his foot down in that way for quite a long time. So I think the thing to really watch out for now is how this develops between the two. I think a lot of it's going to be, the key is what we haven't seen this week is whether Max has reached out to Lando, whether they've talked about it. But of course, we're coming back to kind of like the scene of the original crime, if you want, in terms of 2021. You had the Lewis Max issue. I think half of Formula One Twitter still spend half of their their lives arguing about who was at fault there. But the fact we're coming into that, McLaren feel good that they can win. Obviously, Red Bull want to keep on winning. I just think it's turned the temperature of the season right up now. And I think the reckless question, the point to go back to your original question, Katie, that moment there, I think it happened so quickly. I don't know if it was reckless. I think it was more just Max getting his elbows out. But I think we'll see more and more now if those two are going wheel to wheel. I think Lando, a bit like Lewis had to in 21, will have to change his mindset. If he thinks Max is reckless, I think Lewis in 21 thought Max was reckless. And he was like, okay, the only way to beat this guy, yeah, exactly, is to kind of be a little reckless yourself, kind of put your foot right on that line as well and say, right, I can do this as well. And I think that's why the dynamic now is hopefully in a similar place, because I think that as great as it is that Max and Lando have this friendship, ultimately the time F1 is best is when you have, this kind of this edge between drivers and this kind of desire to want to beat each other, but also some history and some, some really kind of pent up frustration. So obviously not saying that I want to see them crash every race, because to Laurence's point, like one of them deserved to win that race fair and square on track. But the fact that Lando now has that in his head, I think is key. So I don't think that specifically was reckless, but I think that it just fits the mold of what Max has been for a long time. And I actually tweeted I think I quote tweeted like, oh, I agree with what Stella said. My mentions were just complete trash for like 24 hours, because people were saying, oh, you're just part of the British media, blah blah blah. But I just don't see how you can deny it. It is part of Max's character. And what was even so I actually listened to this race coming back. I was driving back from a wedding, and I was listening to the comms, Alex Jakes and Jolyon Palmer on F1 TV, like through the app. And obviously you can't see the incident, but in my head I was like, I bet you Max has kind of done what Rosberg did to Lewis in 2016. And when I watched it back, I immediately got home and watched it. It was exactly how I'd imagined what they'd done, because obviously they'd described it, but you can't quite picture it yourself.
Sure.
And I think that's kind of telling, is that you could tell, like, I bet Max has kind of just left no room open whatsoever. But yeah, sorry, I kind of went around the houses there answering your point, Katie. But yeah, it's Max. It's classic Max, isn't it? Really,
it is. Which I don't necessarily fault him for that, because they're all unbelievable competitors, right? Like, and I think after the race, he said something to the effect of, "Well, I didn't show up to come in second, right? Like, I'm fighting for wins out here, regardless if he has the best car or not." The moving under braking, I think, is interesting, and Laz, you kind of alluded to it. Although it's not something that should be done, it's not condoned. They've changed rules because of it. It seems like it's kind of like an incredible skill to be able to do it. Was there a driver that Max's ability reminds you of in the past that had that ability and did that from time to time, Laz?
Well, I think the general kind of determination to stay ahead at all costs possible. I guess that's a Michael Schumacher kind of trait. It's an Ayrton Senna kind of trait. It does exist among, a lot of the very top drivers in the history of the sport. But I don't think it's also a necessity to be a top driver, in Formula One. With Lewis, I think it's less that case that he would, really kind of move on someone at the last minute. And it's an interesting one, because sometimes, especially with that corner up there, is that, you can position your car again to undercut the other driver and get a better drive out of the corner if they go on to the inside. There's a few things you can do to then try and line up a move into turn 4. And also potentially if it stayed in DRS, it did look like Lando had the faster car, but if it stayed in DRS, he might have been able to stick with him. And then of course there was the 5-second penalty hanging over Lando for the track limits. So I feel like sometimes it's a little bit unnecessary. He is immensely talented, but it's just how he uses that talent in moments like that is a bit questionable. But I just put it down to a mindset. It's just a different way of looking at it that Max has. He just cannot let go of leads, of wins. And like you said, he said, if I start accepting second place, I may as well not bother turning up in the first place. That's the mentality. And in a way that's understandable. But I think where you have to draw a line, and this is where the stewards have to, give out penalties, is when it becomes dangerous. And I feel like that's exactly what they did on lap 64, when Max left Lando with no room and they both got punctures. And so, that I feel like, as much as Andrea says turning around saying, he doesn't get told and all that kind of stuff. It's like, well, he did. He also got a penalty in Monza in 21. I think the one in 2021 that really went unpunished was the Brazil dive bomb, funnily enough, which left them both out in the runoff area, him and Lewis Hamilton. But weirdly, that was kind of like almost like positions reversed a bit. So, this is just the way Max is. I don't think he's ever really going to change. Even if you change the rules and he picks up penalties, I think in the moment he's still always going to be that way. And the impression I get from Red Bull as well, if you listen to some of the comms they had with him initially before on lap 63, when they're saying, Lando's putting you in difficult positions and all this kind of stuff. Then even afterwards, Christian Horner came on and kind of affirmed Max's take on it, which was that the Lando was doing stuff which was just as bad by kind of coming dive bombing to the right, to the left. But this whole dive bombing thing, I feel like Max does this the whole time. This is exactly how he
kettle black, wasn't it, a little bit?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you look at I wouldn't call it a dive bomb, because I think that's unfair on what Lando did, but also what Max did in Spain. To get that position on Lando at the start, required really forceful overtaking, beautifully done. And then against George Russell later in that race in Spain, it required a really decisive move. Again, beautifully done. So this is what Max can do when things are going well, but it just seems to be when things are kind of going against him a bit, that's when he gets a little bit carried away. But I mean, it is absolute entertainment. It is fantastic to see drivers want to win on that level. And of course, we don't want to see an accident at the end of every head to head, but for them to be able to race like that lap after lap after lap is actually really good, because that's not something we've always had in Formula One, and it's often a criticism that gets leveled at Formula One that the drivers can't do that.
I thought it was amusing as well. After they've collided, Max still then puncture on while he's on three wheels, he still drifts across the track and kind of squeezes Lando off. So even then, when he's like, he doesn't know how badly damaged Lando's car is, his mindset is still, no, I'm not letting you pass. Like and I saw a bunch of kind of people filming that as it happened on like TikTok and stuff, and so many of them are like, Max, get out of the way. What's like? So it is. I think mindset is the exact right way to put this. It is, it is just deep in Max. Just on the point Laurence made, the one point I wanted to make, that's I think where Formula One is never really going to be able to solve this properly is, and Laurence kind of covered it, but Max did get a penalty. He got a 10-second penalty, and just because of the way the race played out, that just didn't have any impact. So the only other option is, you always say, if you have an incident in a race, the penalties for the next race. But then I'm not sure how fair that is, because you could still go win the race in question, so it's difficult. It's similar to, again, I keep coming back to Silverstone 21, but in that, I feel like in the aftermath of it, everyone lost the fact that Lewis did get a penalty for that, and it just happened, the way the race played out, he was obviously in the quirk of the rules of the safety car, and you can argue about whether those rules are right or not. He was able to come back and win the race, but it was like, well, he still did get a penalty, and it's like, how much more can the stewards give? So I think sometimes the rule book, and in this case, I'm not there saying, oh, Lewis didn't do anything wrong and Max did get penalized. It's just a quirk of the rule book that it didn't, like, I think a lot of people were like, oh, well, Lando didn't even finish the race, how's it fair that Max finished fifth? It's like, all right, well, his car just wasn't as badly damaged, that's just how it was. And he did get, if that race had finished under the safety car, a 10-second penalty would have dropped him out of the points, So it's just one of those things. And I don't know if there's a perfect remedy for that, because if you start throwing the penalties forward, that's great. But then, I don't know, Max could have had that incident and won that race and be like, actually, yeah, I'll take, like, if to win a race, you've just got to knock someone off the track, and then you just get a 3-place or a 5-place grid penalty. Some teams
for the
might say,
next race,
Some teams might say, all right, well, let's
people.
try it. Especially later into the season, you get like. So I'm just saying, it's difficult to come up with a solution that doesn't have kind of potential like pothole, loopholes in it. Just to kind of defend the stewards a little bit. But
you could do penalties, and they can't because it's not in the rules. But you could change the rules and have penalties based on positions. So if Max finishes 5th, he has a 2-place penalty, finishes 7th.
That's true.
You know,
yeah, that would be an easy way to do it, wouldn't it? Actually,
it's the way it works with group positions. You know, it's not like you get penalized 0.5 of a second off your qualifying time. You get group positions.
Okay.
So I've always kind of wondered. I'm sure there's a very good reason that people are yelling out that doesn't happen.
I've never actually thought of that before, but you're right. It is the same. It's the same principle, isn't it? I wonder if, I mean, I wonder if there's ways that teams can very cleverly kind of work around that with the other car. I don't know. I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure maybe they've looked at it. I don't know, but I'd never actually considered doing that in race. But that's an incredibly simple solution by the sounds of it. We'll have to ask the FIA on at Silverstone why that hasn't been implemented, because that does sound good.
Had the collision not happened between the two, Max Verstappen wins the race still, Laz?
No, well, it depends on the penalties. How
probably not on track, yeah.
The penalties that that didn't get given out would have come because Lando did get a 5-second penalty for track limits. They actually served that when his wrecked car came back in. So before they wheeled it back into the garage, they let it sit there for 5 seconds to make sure that didn't turn into a grid penalty in Silverstone. So Lando would have had that hanging over him. The big question is whether, and I don't know why the stewards didn't actually pick up on this at all, is whether Max would have got a penalty for the time when Lando overtook him. He went off track, but then managed to kind of find the grip on the outside and ended up still in the lead going down to turn 4. There you could argue that depending on your view of that overtake by Lando, I'm sure Max would have a different opinion, but you could argue that Max gained an advantage by going off the track and kept the position. So let's say that had been a 5-second penalty, it might have balanced out, and then you would have had a race to the end. But no, I genuinely think anyone else in that Red Bull, Lando probably would have overtaken and won the race because his car was faster. It's just because it was Max and the way he was defending, and partly his skill, partly his determination, and then this extra bit of Maxness that will never ever give up. That's what led to the collision. But I think any other driver in that car, and Lando Norris goes on to win that race. So it's fascinating as well, because if you look at the last few races, I think all the way back to China, the only one that hasn't had Max Verstappen and Lando Norris in first and second in one or another was Monaco. So of course the only one where Norris beat Max was Miami. But it was kind of coming in a way in that we had all these races where they were very close. In Miami, of course, the safety car switched it to Norris's favor. In Canada, the safety car switched it to Max's favor. So we didn't really see them go wheel to wheel. And so at some point, we knew along these races, they were going to have to go wheel to wheel. And it was going to be thrilling to watch. So we finally got it. And of course, it ended in tears. But it will be so interesting to see what happens next. What it's like the next time their wheels wheel, and that could absolutely be in Silverstone. And from what we know about Max and the way that the wheel-to-wheel battles went with Lewis in 2021, it's only going to get more and more aggressive. And there's this thing now where with Max, if you start backing out, you've lost the battle. You need to put your car in there. You need to be able to make bold overtaking maneuvers, and you need to give him almost as much, as good as he gives. So yeah, it's going to be really, really good to see. And I guess the other question is, and this is actually what you asked me first, Katie, and I didn't answer it, is what happens to their friendship? Because going back to that Miami victory, Max was one of the people that was partying with Lando until the early hours, and there were some cool videos and stuff like that. I feel like, depending on what's been said in between, will depend on whether they can go back to that level of friendship. And Lando made it very clear in Austria that he expects Max to come to him and for Max to apologize in some way. And he said that if Max doesn't accept responsibility for it, or tries to suggest that it wasn't his fault, it was Lando's fault, then Lando said he'll lose a lot of respect for Max. And so that could be a subplot that rumbles on in this season, and then hopefully into next season, if McLaren can keep up this competitiveness and we have a title fight against two drivers who have that little bit of history and needle and that extra determination to beat one another.
To that point, take the drivers out of the equation. Do you feel like, Nate, McLaren has the strongest car now?
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like it, but then I think it's hard to read. I think they are so closely balanced. I mean, for all of the chat we've had, I think Red Bull felt, I mean, from, speaking to Horner today, for example, they seemed pretty confident they should have been out of Lando's range without all of those things happening. So again, and I think it's so close between the two that race to race, it's literally like this team is slightly ahead of the other, and then flip it around. But I think McLaren now are in just a position that no team's really been in relative to relative to Red Bull since Mercedes in 21, which is they can go into every race now thinking we can win. And you don't always have to be the outright fastest car. You just got to be fast enough in the right moments. But I mean, Silverstone last year, as I remember, McLaren was super strong. I mean, Piastri could have got on the podium. I think Lando did. They're going to be right. I wouldn't be surprised if they are the fastest car this weekend. And as a British person going to cover a British Grand Prix, I've seen what that place is like when Lewis wins. That's pretty exciting, and this is where the pantomime of it is going to be great, is because Max got a bit of booze. I forget the race. I think it was Spain, wasn't it? If Max is anywhere in Silverstone, I think he's going to be the kind of the pantomime villain. And actually, I know people get upset by that, but I kind of like that. Like, I'm sure Lando might get a bit of heat now in Zandvoort. I kind of like that. So, they might have the fastest car, and having the fastest car in front of your home crowd is always a nice pick me up after a pretty difficult weekend.
It's not even who's got the fastest car race to race. Within a race, it can change.
Yeah.
So, that's what we saw in Austria, that in the first stint on fresh medium tires head to head, the Red Bull was way quicker. Went to the hard tires, and Lando, I think, benefited a bit from some of the traffic. Max got stuck in a bit of the traffic, but they were pretty evenly matched. And then as soon as they went onto the final set of tires, McLaren had saved fresh mediums because that was their strategy right from the very start. Red Bull had initially hoped to go for hard tires at the end of that stint, but having seen how bad it was in the second stint, had to go to a used set of mediums. And that little difference, those few laps put on those medium tires, on Max's car before they went on, just completely changed it. And those margins are so tight now that just the smallest thing can go wrong. And that's why I think Max is really earning his money at Red Bull at the moment, because he's able to take it to that extra little level, that little bit further out of reach for McLaren again and again and again. But it doesn't take much for it to start going the other way, and for McLaren to have the advantage. So tiny margins at the moment.
Margins that I think Mercedes hopes that they're closing in on, and they obviously reap the benefits of the drama and the collision that ensued between Max and Lando. George Russell picked up his second race win in Formula One. I thought one of the better moments of the race, one of the more funny moments, was when Toto came on the radio and said, "George, you can win this." And it was almost like Laz, he kind of freaked out in the moment, and he was right in the middle of a corner. He obviously gets himself through and he's able to finish the race. But I loved that moment where he kind of had a minor freak out when Toto came on the radio.
Yeah, Toto said that was the dumbest thing he's done during his time as Mercedes team principal.
Timing.
But it shows you how much it meant to Mercedes. It's been so long, since the end of 2022 when George won in Brazil, that they've won a race. And so it really did mean everything to Toto. And he has this button, he sits in the garage. He doesn't actually sit on the pit wall, but he sits in the garage and he has this button ahead of him where he can basically override everything and talk directly to the drivers. And I seem to remember him saying before that he joked, I don't know if it was true, that on occasion Mercedes has just disconnected that button, so Toto thinks he's talking to the drivers, but he's not actually, because at times it's not actually that helpful. But and George was able to laugh it off afterwards, of course. But he did say, in that moment when you're concentrating, in that very moment, there were two slower cars ahead of him with punctures, or maybe he'd just passed them, but you've got all this traffic around you as well. Super high speed circuit. You're not sure what's around the next corner. Could be debris, could be all sorts of stuff. And all of a sudden, mid corner, absolute concentration. And Toto's voice comes in your ear, not just speaking, yelling. That did actually nearly, he said nearly make him lose concentration for that moment and crash out. But fortunately, he didn't for Mercedes. And I think that was an incredibly important win for Mercedes, even if it wasn't, on merit. They weren't going to win it if Max and Lando finished. But I think given the momentum they've started to build in the last few races, to get that victory on the board is very important for them.
For sure. And going into Silverstone. I mean, Nate, you mentioned Lando being a British driver and a home race coming up this weekend. Obviously, George and Lewis are both two British drivers. It would be massive if they're able to kind of continue this momentum. They brought upgrades over the past few weekends. We've seen them kind of trend in the right direction. I don't know if you chalk this up to right place, right time, and that's why they're able to win this race, or if they actually have found something with these upgrades and then they're going to continue to build on it in Silverstone this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, definitely they obviously wouldn't have won without that happening ahead, but at the same time, that's why, being in those other positions is important, isn't it? If you're not good enough to be in third, then you're not going to benefit if the first two guys go out. Yeah, I think it seems like Mercedes is now ahead of Ferrari, which, a few months ago was pretty, unthinkable for that. So I don't know. I think they're still potentially a step behind, but they're in that kind of window now where McLaren probably were at points last year where you're like, oh, they're kind of close, but maybe not close enough all the time, to contend. And now that you have kind of McLaren and Red Bull maybe taking chunks out of each other in this kind of fight, I think if you're Mercedes now, the really exciting part is that door of opportunity might open itself up a lot more, especially if Lando and Max's friendship is done, dusted, if those two guys are going wheel to wheel all the time now, you're suddenly thinking, I mean, you don't go into every race being like, I hope the guys ahead of us crash and that we win the race, but I think it's just an even bigger incentive. You're like, there's opportunity ahead if these things happen. And for Russell as well, just to go to him, I think it's really important for him. He was gutted with himself in Canada, wasn't he? Letting that win go. So I think getting the win back so quickly, I think at the moment, actually, Russell's really establishing himself as obviously stepping up now that Lewis is going. I think it's just all kind of falling Russell's way all the time. So, and I don't mean that disparagingly. I just mean Russell's just doing the better job, it seems, in the crucial moments. But yeah, I think if you're Mercedes, must be mad. The turnaround there is, I think the McLaren's turnaround last year before the Austrian Grand Prix was huge, but what Mercedes is slowly doing now is similar. And the dream now is that McLaren's trajectory, Mercedes' trajectory, and maybe even Ferrari's trajectory are all kind of in a similar place by the time we get to the start of next season, even if they're not super close like they are right now. If they're close enough to kind of be in the mix, then I think we're in for a really special time. So I have to eat my words from a few months ago, because I thought that we were destined for like a year and a half of just complete trash out in front, and now suddenly F1 is just it's just so tantalizing and so exciting again, which is great.
Yeah, but you weren't alone. I mean, everybody was gearing up for another season.
I think I left Japan thinking like this is going to be a long year, and now I'm glad it's a long year, because obviously Max is so far ahead. It's kind of the only way that we might get something out of it. But yeah, it's definitely looking a lot different, isn't it? It's almost like two different seasons, I think. If you take those first five and then you take the ones we've had since, it's like 2024 A and 2024 B, and B has been way better than A ever was. So yeah, loving that.
There was obviously plenty of other storylines, minor storylines, compared to Lando and Max's scuffle. I'm curious, we've talked about this at length on other podcast episodes. Sergio Perez continues to struggle. I mean, he was wedged between two Haas's. Haas, congratulations on double points. Lovely job. But Sergio Perez finishes P7, Laz. I mean, is that just, it is what it is? We come to accept that from Sergio Perez at this point. Should we expect more from him in that car?
Absolutely, you should expect more from him in that car. And I think Red Bull are expecting more from him in that car, because right now, there's still this belief that actually, the results aren't really quite going this way yet, but they could come under threat in the Constructors' Championship purely on the basis that Sergio Perez isn't performing on the level that car should be. And you can look at Q3 and say, I think he didn't have any new soft tires left, but that was because he'd used them getting through Q1 and Q2. So yeah, he's just getting himself into these spirals where ultimately the performance isn't there, and he's struggling to find it. And of course, you're up against Max Verstappen, who's able to do all these weird and wonderful things with a Formula One car that Checo just can't. It seems like he cannot operate on that level. And then we saw this last year, that he then started experimenting with different setups that didn't really suit the way he wanted to drive the car, and he just got completely lost. And then he came into this season and it all looked so good. Of course, Red Bull had that big advantage at the start of this year, which definitely helped because, you know, he could still have a little bit of a gap to Max, and there were no cars to fill it in and push him further down the order. But he did genuinely look more competitive, closer to Max. And then, yeah, something just changed. And he's not got it. And I don't think Red Bull know what it is. I certainly don't think Checo's fully aware of what it is, or more importantly, he doesn't know how to change it back. But he really does need to start performing and putting in results that are worthy of that car, because, you know, you look at the other top teams, and yes, there's usually one driver doing better. If you look at McLaren, you know, clearly Norris is a little bit more together, able to put together the results than Piastri, but Piastri's not miles off. You know, you look at Mercedes, and quite surprisingly, George is the one who's got the advantage over Lewis. But again, at any given weekend, you feel like Lewis has got the potential to beat George. And then, yeah, you look at Red Bull, and it's just so one-sided. And I don't know how much longer they can continue with that. Certainly into next year, if we get this competitive championship that we're hoping for, then definitely the Constructors' Championship's under threat. So he's on this 2-year contract, you know, into 25, 26. But I think he actually needs to start performing to make sure that kind of comes to fruition and goes to its full length.
Do you think there'd be any chance that they regret extending that contract already at this point, or because we know that Red Bull is not one to necessarily withhold or keep a contract, right? They'll end it sooner than the actual terms. Do you think that it doesn't matter to them that they extended them?
Yeah, so I think every single driver who's got a Red Bull contract, whether you're Max, Checo, Ricciardo, or Tsunoda, you've got performance clauses baked in there. I think like De Vries, I think, had 5 races, and then Red Bull can basically terminate the deal. I'd be stunned if Perez doesn't have the same in his. And actually, I think the regret. I mean, I think they're already starting to question it, and I think that the logic from Red Bull, they wanted the longevity there as well, but I think last year Red Bull felt, okay, Checo's performances kind of spiraled because we left the contract situation kind of up in the air. We re-signed Ricciardo. Like, maybe that was the reason why things kind of got away. He, you know, uncertain, because none of us, no one in the world wants uncertainty over their job, right? Even though you can say these guys are, you know, making all this money, you still don't want uncertainty about what you're doing the following season. So the logic was, we want to keep this team as unchanged as we can, but also, like, okay, look, if we just cut all this noise out straight away, give Checo this contract, he'll get to that level. And really, the opposite has happened. Since he's signed that deal, he's looked worse than I don't think he looked this bad last year. I mean, to Laurence's point, he finished between the two Haas drivers, and Max Verstappen had a crash on the last lap, had a pit stop, had a 10-second penalty, and still finished ahead of him. Yeah. Which is insane. You know, at a circuit like that as well, that, you know, Red Bull should have had both cars up there. So I think alarm bells are starting to ring there, and Formula One is a cutthroat place, and the bad news for Checo Perez is he's in the most cutthroat team of them all, a team that will make those decisions. We know they will make those decisions. I think Perez, I think it will be hard for them to do it, because I think he's very popular at that team, and he doesn't cause any issues. But ultimately, when the field is getting this tight together, you just can't put yourself in that position. But then Red Bull have kind of got an issue there, because where do you go? I'm not sure. I think Ricciardo's kind of temperament, you know, he's getting better recently, but I think there's doubts about how Ricciardo deals with that pressure. I don't think they're convinced Yuki's the answer there either. So I don't know. I think they've just kind of got themselves into this kind of weird situation now, where it's like, well, if you do get rid of Checo, how many better options are there that are available in the short term? So I think that ultimately will be clouding that issue as well. And considering Red Bull always prided themselves on the strength of their driver program, you know, it's not a situation they should be in. They should have a ready-made guy waiting to come up, and clearly in their heads, they don't think they do. So I think that's one of the big, I know we're going to be talking about Max and Lando all week going to Silverstone, but if Checo has another bad weekend, I think he's got 2 races before the summer break where suddenly all the focus is on him. And not a nice position to be in, especially when you're as kind of experienced and established as him, because, you know, he shouldn't be in this situation at all.
Yeah, just one detail to add, because I know that we do have a lot of Checo fans who listen to this, and I think sometimes they call us up on not kind of picking up on some of the stuff that happens to him. But in Austria, one of the reasons that he was so slow in the race was damage from that I think it was contact with Piastri early in the race. So he had a kind of hole in the side pod that was creating quite a lot of drag on the straights. But again, why was he that far back in in the field?
better. Yeah.
As soon as you're in the middle of the field, you're putting yourself at so much more risk of those incidents, and especially if you've got a fast car, you're looking to make up positions, perhaps taking risks or whatever more than you should be, and that pressure's building. So again, it goes back to that just spiraling thing that happens when if a weekend doesn't start out right, if he can't get the setup where he wants it compared to Max, and then he has to chew through more tires to get into Q3, which should just be a given in a Red Bull pretty much at any track. I know they've got weaker tracks like Monaco, probably Singapore and Azerbaijan as well coming up, but he should be in Q3, and to be in a position where you have no fresh tires in Q3 is not good either for a Red Bull driver. So yeah, it's not a good situation, and I think Nate's right. They've got to assess it, do everything they can to try and help him, and I think they absolutely do, because there's no one at Red Bull that wants to lose the Constructors' Championship along those lines. And then if it's an unsolvable issue, then I guess you have to take action.
A bit of news from team personnel movement that I just want to hit because I think it's important to note. Former Mercedes engine boss Andy Cowell is joining Aston Martin as its CEO. Laz, can you just tell us what this means, who Andy Cowell is, and what he brings to the table for Aston Martin, and how big of a get is this for the green team?
It's huge. Andy Cowell was for such a long time he was at Mercedes engine department in Brixworth, and was a real kind of permanent fixture there, it seemed, and was so important to the huge advantage they had going into the 2014 season that basically paved the way for all those championships that came after. It wasn't all about the engine, towards the end of that period, but it just gave them that head start that they needed. So he's a huge asset to any team. And of course, Aston Martin are there trying to build this super team, trying to convince Adrian Newey to go there. And I think actually bringing in someone like Andy Cowell and potentially having Newey alongside him, if you'd mentioned that in 2015, 2016 as a technical leadership duo, people would have said, well, we'll give you the championship already. It's not even worth competing, because that was the level that Andy Cowell was able to bring to the engine side, and Adrian Newey, of course, brings to the aero and chassis side. Interestingly, it's with Aston Martin, so it's CEO rule, basically taken over the role that Martin Whitmarsh, who's not always that kind of front and center in the way Aston Martin's running things, but was basically at the top in this kind of overarching CEO role. So to bring Cowell in there, I think it's exactly the kind of position that he'll relish. He'll be able to work with Honda, which of course becomes a works engine supplier to Aston Martin in 2026. So all of the brilliant ideas and experience and everything else that he gained during his Mercedes time will be able to work with Honda on, and then also just that integration between a chassis and an engine, which is so important, especially with these new regulations where the two are so closely linked because of what they're asking the engines to do. So I think this is a huge signing. I don't think it's far off if they do get Newey. I honestly don't think it's far off that kind of appointment. It's that level. It really is. A big deal.
All to build cars for Lance Stroll and Fernando Alonso.
I hear you say that, Laz. And if Adrian Newey were to go to Aston Martin, the only question then you have about that team, because Fernando Alonso is obviously an incredibly proven driver, multiple world championships. Your only question is Lance Stroll at that point.
Yeah.
So it's like it feels like Laurence Stroll, his father, is putting his money where his mouth is. He's trying to get as much talent as possible to infuse into the team, whether that's on track or within team personnel. And yet he sticks with his son, and you just don't know how much is his son going to hold them back if they were to get an Adrian Newey in place. I don't know. It's just such an interesting dynamic for a team because I do feel like they've done a really good job putting key people in place for the future.
And I mean, look at Checo right now, right? Let's flip that team around. Let's say it's Aston Martin out in front, and it's Alonso who's dominating, and it's Stroll who's kind of stinking the place out with his results in the same way. Suddenly, I think they've actually put him in a pretty rough position because they know this narrative exists already. He doesn't like it, clearly. I think it's completely fair. But he's going to have to make that decision, and he might as well make that decision now before we get to that point than have to make it 2 years down the line when it's like, well, Aston Martin could have won the constructors this year, but the son of the owner didn't pull his weight and didn't score as many points, and you get there. So, to be honest with you, just wider speaking about Aston Martin, I think super teams are always kind of, this is like the Galacticos of Real Madrid put this super team together years ago, and it wasn't necessarily, I mean, it won a couple of league titles, but it didn't win everything that they thought it would. So as much as it's great to see him put it together, I always wonder, putting a lot of great accomplished people together, it looks great on paper. You've got a lot of egos there. You've got how do you manage people? Because you've also got Dan Fallows is already there. He's come over from Red Bull a few years ago. You've got a lot of guys that have gone there for better money than they were probably on with the teams they were at before. I don't know. I think that whole dynamic of that team, it's either gonna be the dream team and just this incredible success story. And I think the bigger risk is, away from Lance Stroll even, is that you've just created this kind of beast that has all of this talent, has all this incredible brain power, but just isn't able to kind of corral it together. So, as a team to keep an eye on, I think Aston Martin are going to be, whatever happens there, it's just going to be a great story. So, a lot of cool things happening. And I know they're not in the right place right now, but I think that I think they knew this year was just going to be a little bit, it wasn't going to be maybe not as bad as this, but I think the future looks bright for them. But how bright, I guess we'll see.
To agree with that point Nate's making. I would say that the Carroll, I think, is one of those inspirational leaders that that actually really does try and encourage people in every corner of the factory to pull their weight. I don't think there's a shred of ego really there in the way he operates. And then with Newey, I think you'd have someone who can inspire across the board. And then I just wanted to pick up the Stroll point, because I think it's so interesting. And I don't really disagree with everything that's said, but I think if you just put yourself in Laurence Stroll's mind, like he's not going to get rid of Lance, is he?
No,
I mean, unless Lance turns around to him and says, "I don't want to be a Formula One driver anymore." Like
I think he might already have said that to him. he can even say that to him, and he'll say, "No, I'm still keeping you."
Well, what was interesting was talking to him about his new contract. In Austria, I went along to his media session on the Thursday, and it's like, well, why did it take this long? Like, we didn't really expect it to be, a negotiation period or anything like that. We just thought it was a given. And he said, like, he had to think about what he wanted. So, and he wasn't super enthusiastic in that point. But I think Laurence Stroll will not. I don't think he'll deviate from it, because if he had a shred of that in his mind, I think he would have done it already. He's a very decisive man. I think he looks at Lance, and I think he thinks the natural, like, raw talent is in there somewhere. And I'd agree. And if you look at recent races, actually he's been performing very well compared to Fernando. I think Fernando's hit a bit of a rough patch for whatever reason. But I just can't see a situation, as much as we may all feel that it's the right move or whatever, where he gets rid of Lance. And if it comes to it, and they have a car that can compete for championships, and Fernando Alonso is in the car next to him, Fernando will probably go and win that championship. And maybe from an Aston Martin point of view, from a marketing point of view, that would be enough. And if they slightly miss out on the constructors, then so be it. But I think until they're in that position and Lance has turned around and said, "Don't want to do it anymore," I don't think it's going to change.
I'm looking at the Silverstone schedule coming up this weekend, and you mentioned Galacticos, which then obviously got my mind on soccer. When is qualifying on Saturday? Because I know England's got a match against Switzerland, and I know how much you support Gareth Southgate, Nate. So I just want to know.
Look, I want to know
how you're going to be able to pull the daily double.
I just don't think he's cut up. But I mean, hey, if we clip this up, if Gareth Southgate wins the Euros, best manager of all time, I think qualifying is 2 p.m. and the match is at 5 p.m.
Oh, okay.
So it'll be in the paddock. And I remember this actually happened in 2018. And the big screen kind of outside the paddock had the England's World Cup quarterfinal on that year when we beat, I want to say Ukraine or maybe Sweden 3-0. And then we lost that semi-final. But I remember being in the paddock and basically we just stopped coming up with excuses to go outside. We were just like, let's just go outside and watch the game for 40 minutes. So I think there'll be a lot of that this weekend. And yeah, I think a lot of people will stay in the circuit to find screens to watch it. So, and that's always kind of great because there's just so much on. There's Wimbledon on. There was one year American. This will completely switch off our American listeners, but the following year after that, the Cricket World Cup final was on when we were at Silverstone, and the Wimbledon final was on as well. So you had all of the non-English journalists kind of transfixed by Djokovic and Nadal, and then all of us watching England win the Cricket World Cup, which was going to surprise people. We had never done until that point, even though cricket's the most English thing on earth. And yeah, you could hear people around the circuit kind of cheering for that. So could be a party atmosphere Sunday. It could be not that if we lose, but yeah, I think it's going to be a nervy weekend all around for everybody.
Football, Wimbledon, Silverstone, all good. You say cricket, and I'm immediately like, nah.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll teach you cricket. I keep saying to Ryan McGee, I'm going to teach him cricket when he finally gets to the UK for a trip. So
yeah,
well, I feel like McGee's just such a sports loving person. You as well, Katie. I think once you know what's going on,
you have to have
like
an understanding.
You have to have a beer in your
it.
hand. You have to understand it, and you have to have a beer in your hand to really like it. If you don't have a beer in your hand,
Laz agrees.
Don't watch cricket. Like you need some you need some of that to get through, I think.
Will Jude Bellingham's goal, his bicycle kick, will that go down as like where were you when? Is that big of a goal or no? Will it was just a great goal in the history of England football.
I think it depends what happens next. Like we get knocked out to Switzerland, then no one's probably gonna remember it. But I can tell you exactly where I was. I was in the Austrian Grand Prix Media Center, the Red Bull Ring Media Center, watching it on the big screens there.
Did everybody go wild?
Sorry?
Did everybody go wild?
Well, the about 6 or 7 English journalists all around me went wild, and everyone else just looked over their shoulder like, oh god, before we got rid of them. Like I thought they were out.
I was actually rage messaging these guys because I was back home. I was like, Southgate's got to go after this, and then looked up and the ball's going in, so I deleted the message quickly. And
too good. I love it. All right. We've kind of previewed Silverstone as we've gone through talking about everything that happened in Austria. So I will just put you to your predictions. The three of us did not get a single pick correct in Austria. That's thanks to Max Verstappen and Lando Norris. I think we had both of those guys on our podiums in some degree, but obviously the collision took them both out.
Can I just say that had Lando overtaken Max or Max raced fairly and Lando got fast, then I would have got it bang on.
No points for that.
But that didn't happen.
It didn't, but I'm just saying,
you were on to something.
It nearly did.
I'd like to say that I had Max and then Lando and then maybe Charles, which obviously that wasn't going to happen. But anyways, Laz, you have 9 points. Nate, you have 12, and I remain with 13. Laurence Edmondson, make your picks.
Okay. I haven't actually thought about this at all going through this podcast. Right. Okay. So in third place, I'm going to go with Lewis Hamilton.
Ooh, okay.
In second place, Max Verstappen. First place, Lando Norris. Hopefully with those two having a intense but clean battle for the lead for the majority of the race. But yeah, this was a track where McLaren looked very good last year. It's also a track where Merc have gone well recently, and every track is a track where Max goes well. So that's my logic behind it.
I'd love to see it. That's a good one. He always takes the good ones. Go ahead, Nate.
So did you say Lando Max or Max Lando?
He said Lando Max Lewis.
Correct.
Okay. I'm going to change it up then slightly. I'm going to say Lewis third because Lewis is great at Silverstone. Lando second. Max first. So that is different to what you said, or is that the same?
It is, yeah. But just swapping the top two.
Yeah.
You could pick either, and I don't think either is wrong.
Yeah. That's it. And I think, for all of the pressure or the talking point around Max, to give him his dues, one thing we've seen time and time again with Max is when he's fired up about something, when he's got that kind of me against the world attitude, he's no one's ever unbeatable, but he's close to it. And I think we're going to see that Max, in a big way. So I expect a big kind of, as much as you can bounce back from nearly winning a race, a big bounce back weekend for Max. And we put you in a tough spot here, Katie, now, haven't we?
You haven't. We've never done like repeats, right? Like you can't just repeat someone's picks.
Yeah, you can.
I think you can. I think you
Have
can.
we
I
ever
mean,
made
obviously, if you both get it right, then you don't get any more points. Like you just stay where you are, but then you're leading, so that's actually a great move.
Is it though? I don't want to.
If
For
you
some
think
reason,
if you think one of us is right, yeah.
for some reason, it feels wrong to just copy you all.
I mean, none of us said George coming off the back of a victory in the top 3, so that's a pretty good shout. Piastri finished second in Austria.
All right.
Just putting them out there.
Oh, I'm gonna do Max Verstappen, Lando Norris. Oh shoot, I'm doing this backwards. Okay, wait, hold on. In third place, Oscar Piastri. Second place, Lando Norris. Oh, this is so lame. I want Euro's verdicts. I want Euro's predictions. And then I'm going to put Max on P1. So Max, Lando, Oscar Piastri in that order. And I hope for my sake that it doesn't happen, even though I'm leading the race at the point. Does that make sense?
It does.
All right. Cool. You're both going, obviously, right?
Indeed.
When will you head that way? Can you make day trips or do you stay near there?
Yeah, I'm going from London, and actually, it's the general election in the United Kingdom.
God, you guys are busy. There's a lot going on.
Yeah.
So there's an awful
We're all
lot
voting for Jude Bellingham.
It's gone my way. So yeah, going to the polling booth on Thursday morning, probably as early as it opens, and then jumping on my motorbike and going up to Silverstone.
Motorbike. Oh,
Yeah.
lovely.
I think Laurence and I are both similar. My polling station is like two blocks from me, so I can walk to that, get a coffee, come back, drive up to Silverstone.
Nice.
And then I'm actually sitting out Friday like an amateur. And then I'm going back up on Saturday. So because it's close enough where you can drive up and so yeah. But no, it's one of the highlights. I mean, for people listening, I know I always get asked by people, which races would you go to? Silverstone would be in the top 5 for me. Of just the atmosphere is fantastic. It's similar to Zandvoort as well. When you've got you've got Lewis and Lando and George, and you've got Max at Zandvoort, etc. Just incredible place. I love it, and the noise is great. It's a nightmare getting in and out on the Saturday and Sunday, but it's one of the small things of it. It's just a great weekend. One of the best parts of the whole season.
Yeah, it looks awesome. Well, I wish you both the best. Enjoy, have so much fun, and we look forward to all of your all's reports and articles, and we will break it all down next week on Unlapped. Have a great weekend, guys. Cheers.